Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this National Tree Week webinar. There are a lot of you coming, and we'll let the doors open, and people are flooding in to give our august panel some sense of where you're all from today. Do you want to just stick in the chat, which is at the bottom of the screen, where you're from, please? Just as a bit of a padder, we've got Portugal for starters. So that we get a sense of where you all are in the world. South Wales and Herefordshire, and where we got Hyde, and far too fast already. I've lost track of where you're all coming from. Brecon Beacons and Dorset and the Peak District and Weston-super-Mare, Barnet in London and Kent and Cranbourne Chase. Lots of you all over the country, basically. Derby and the New Forest, Somerset. Anybody else out there? Slovenia, we've got a truly international audience today. And Monmouth and Somerset, I think we've pretty much covered. Oh, we've got Perth here now. I've not seen a Welsh one, or if I've missed it, we've got Northern Ireland and Dorset. So there's three of the countries definitely. Anglesey, we have now a complete quorum of all four nations present in the room. So thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all. We've still got lots of people coming through the door, so we'll just leave it for a couple more minutes of padding, and then I shall explain what we're doing today. Hello, Ian from Shropshire. It's all right. I know Ian from Shropshire. So cool. All right. I think numbers are stabilising, so I shall do some introductions. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today is obviously part of National Tree Week, and my name is John Stokes, and I'm Director of Tree Science and Research here at the Tree Council. Tree Council is a national charity that brings everybody together for the love of trees. And before I introduce our guests, I'd like to start by introducing National Tree Week itself, because this year is our 50th anniversary of National Tree Week. The organisation actually started with Plant a Tree in '73. And the Tree Council were founded as a result of Dutch elm disease, which devastated landscapes and particularly elms in hedgerows. At the time, the Tree Council was then founded by the government to help set up the restoration of the landscape, to be championing those trees outside woodlands that are there. And we became a charity a couple of years later. Ever since, National Tree Week has been the sort of the starting point of the winter tree planting season. And it's now the sort of biggest annual celebration of trees. And it's not only about the care of planting of trees, but it's also about looking after them and caring for them. So we're delighted that you can all join us today. And a huge thank you for all of you for getting involved in some way this National Tree Week, and especially to our amazing volunteer tree wardens who are out there, and to all our fantastic partners who work tirelessly for the trees all year round. So today we're talking about trees on farms. And we're thrilled to be joined today's conversation by two of the country's best known organic farmers, as well as Ben Norwood, Cornwall Council's lead for Trees on Farms, the research that we were doing under the shared outcomes. And you're going to hear a bit more about them all shortly. I'll just do the little introductions to our guests today. So our first guest is Helen Browning, OBE. Helen was born and brought up on a farm in Wiltshire, which she runs today. Helen is also the Chief Exec of the Soil Association since 2011. She was awarded the OBE in 1998 for her services to farming, and served on the Curry Commission into the Future of Farming in 2002, whose recommendations heralded a shift in UK agricultural policy towards sustainability and environmental stewardship. In 2016, Helen planted thousands of trees on her farm to gauge the effect of integrating productive trees into farmland, with a view to improving overall productivity while enhancing wildlife and protecting the soils. Our second guest is Guy Singh-Watson. Guy has been awarded BBC Radio 4 Farmer of the Year twice, and is the founder of the organic farm and veg box company Riverford Organic Farmers. Over the last 30 years, Guy has taken Riverford from a one-man and a wheelbarrow delivering homemade organic veg to friends, to a national veg box scheme delivering to about 50,000 customers a week. Riverford is now 100% employee owned, but Guy continues to play an active role including spearheading agroforestry projects, notably planting 1,588, a very specific number, 1,588 nut trees across the four farms in 2022. Our last guest is Ben Norwood. Ben is a project officer and has been part of the Cornwall Council's Forest for Cornwall programme for a few years. Ben also led the Shared Outcomes Fund project that we were working on from Tree Council with DEFRA and 5 local authorities, called the Trees Outside Woodland project. And Ben led the pilot in Cornwall, leading on trees in a farm landscape. In his role, he works closely with farmers and landowners, helping them to achieve their tree planting ambitions through advice on tree planting, grants and aftercare. So those are our 3 guests. And what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take some short presentations from each of the 3 of our guests about their work and what they do in their farms. Then I've got some conversational questions that we will have, and at any point you can ask questions by using the Q&A box. I will try to integrate those questions into the conversation as we go, but please do drop us your questions and then we will explore all of those ideas and thoughts that you're having in relation to what the speakers are saying. So, to start, Ben, would you like to introduce what you've been doing, please?
Yeah, so as John said, I'm one of the project officers for the Shared Outcome Fund. And this programme was trying to explore different ways we could get trees outside in the farm landscape. Because at the time, there were no CS options, so countryside stewardship options available to farmers for getting trees if they weren't necessarily traditional orchards, wood pastures or hedgerows. And we were particularly interested in maybe some of the smaller interventions. There could be field corners, looking to create habitat corridors, or then maybe more intensive agroforestry plantings. And so we developed a series of schemes and trial interventions to try and explore this space, trying to work with farmers and landowners about what might work for them. And we designed a grant scheme and approach that tried to encompass flexibility in the scheme and respond to the needs of the landowners, and hopefully encourage them and embolden them to come up with ideas, because ultimately we found that farmers and landowners know their land best, and our role in that was to try and help them with that process, be it through sense checking, appropriate tree species, do they have the right permissions in place, were they aware of what was on their land to start off with. And this led to a really interesting approach and quite organic. We learnt along the way and we evolved the scheme as we went. And it was really important to keep that scheme flexible, because it allowed us to test these interventions. And on the screen, sort of showing you some of the approaches we took. Some of them were looking at things like expanded hedgerow corridors, with the ideas that some farmers and landowners were interested in improving the wider landscape for biodiversity and trying to address the ecological needs. We had other landowners wanting to improve productivity, so they might be implanting sort of alley crops. And also, particularly in our neck of the woods down in Cornwall, a lot of farmers were interested in improving shelter for livestock to try and combat some of these issues we're having with climate change. The trials also allowed us to do a bit of experimentation, trying to look at how we could do things like, for example, get trees in fields in different ways, because traditional ways of getting trees in fields can be very expensive with quite heavy investments in things like guarding. So we had this sort of lovely space to be able to experiment with interventions such as the crown of thorns here, where this was trying to get a maiden tree established in the field protected by a mantle of thorny tree species, with the ideas that some of this temporary guarding that was in place would then be done away, and then you'd have this sort of more naturalistic feel. And so we were able to look into costs of implementing allow farmers the freedom to come up with their own ways of doing this that suited their farm. And another approach we were really interested in exploring was the use of things like well mesh cages. Again, there's an alternative approach to try and reduce that cost of trees getting in the farm landscape. At the time, things like cactus guards were coming on the market, and we wanted to see how effective they were at working. And some of these were fairly new interventions. So, and we've taken some inspiration from our urban tree planting as well, just using well mesh cages to protect trees. And we had some really good results in trying to reduce those costs of getting those infill trees, as opposed to just using traditional wooden and parkland guards. So, the scheme over a couple of years, we planted, it wasn't the main aim for trying to hit tree targets, but incidentally, we planted over 40,000 trees across the 5 local authorities who were participating. So we had Kent, Norfolk County Council, Shropshire County Council, Chichester and Cornwall. So they gave us a really good geographical spread of testing these interventions. And orchards were really popular. Not necessarily traditional orchards, but sort of alternative ways of laying them out and using alternative species choices. So some people being really innovative, looking to the future as to what future crops might be there. And then we were able to, over this pilot, look at survival rates, because one of the questions we get asked quite commonly is that trees get planted out, but how many of them are surviving? So we had this long-term monitoring project set up. And those results are published in more detail in the project outputs. But we found really good survival rates, and actually, despite some very challenging conditions when we, over the course of the project period, that sort of ownership of the projects helped to really encourage people to care for their trees and make sure they were established at the first incident really well. So, we encourage things like applying mulches, choosing the right species for the right locations, making sure that, they were guarded appropriately for the sites as well. And then furthermore, out of the project, some of the outputs we were able to provide and publish were a new Trees on Farms illustrated guide. And this not only has outlining the various systems that are in place, because the idea is that we wanted to communicate some of these concepts not only to farmers and landowners, but also to the general public to try and get their sort of buy-in and support and understanding. But there are also case studies from farmers who are actually delivering this already. And one of the things that we were also being asked is about, I'm growing all these products, how do I get them to market? And so we worked with people like Cranfield University to develop a routes to market information as well. And these are just some examples of some of the systems, and so very visual. Just we were very aware that these some people working with that, like myself, very visual learners, but it was a really great way to try and communicate some of the ideas and approaches to agroforestry in particular, because sometimes there's a lot of language which can be sort of used to hide behind. And so we're wanting to try and demystify some of that. So, yeah, and it was overall a really successful project.
Thank you, Ben. And that's the context, everybody, for National Tree Week and why we were wanting to have today's conversation, because, as Ben said, it's been really successful. We planted 40,000 trees over this route without intentionally trying. And that's meant that we've started to get a real enthusiasm for those trees out there that we could have. And we've been looking at the world slightly differently over recent times. So in England, for example, there is 10% woodland. But that means there's 90% of the countryside where there is the possibility of other trees. And a lot of that landscape is farmland. And as you can see from the picture behind me, the way that you can scatter trees through that landscape becomes really important as part of the future systems. So we then thought it would be really exciting to hear from 2 people who are actually practicing planting trees on their farms, and therefore we invited Helen and Guy to join us. And maybe the best part to do next would be to to get you to explain what you're doing on your farm. So Helen, would you like to explain what you've done on your farm?
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. I've got a few slides as well, I think, just to whiz through, just to first of all show you where we are. Next slide. So we're not far from Swindon, down in the sort of southwest or in the middle of the south. And I'm mostly on, next slide, a tenanted farm. So we farm as tenants of the church, about 1,500, 1,600 acres. And most of that, as I say, is tenanted land. And that's been quite challenging because landlords don't really like you planting trees on their farms. So while I've had a long-term kind of enthusiasm or interest in trees, I wasn't really able to get going with anything until I took on a couple of hundred acres that I actually own. Most of the farm is now dairying. We produce a lot of milk. My daughter and son-in-law are driving the main farming now. So I spend a lot of my time concentrating on the agroforestry when I'm not running the Soil Association. Of course, the Soil Association's got a huge interest in trying to help this happen. Why do I like the idea of trees? Well, you know, all the things you'll know about climate, business resilience as well, actually. I think the two go hand in hand when you've got a lot of livestock, trying to think about how you're going to protect them, shade and shelter as the climate heats up and gets ever wetter, and all the other things that we'll, I'm sure, talk about more today in terms of animal welfare and biodiversity and all the rest of it. So lots of different motivations. Next slide. So I got going in 2016 on this 200 acres, and I was really struggling to find many commercial examples that I thought would inspire farmers and where I could learn about how to do this. I found many more since, but at that time I was really struggling to find good examples. So we had a go at the farm here of doing lots of different things. And this first field, a barn field, is almost like an expanded forest garden. 10-meter row spacings, 5 meters in place in some places, designed to be combined with a poultry system. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see we've got a huge amount of stuff in there, lots and lots of different things, including some things that we don't tend to think of as growing in the UK at the moment, like almonds and apricots. And they were very much, experimental. Let's see what takes. Let's try and anticipate climate change as well as think about how we're going to prevent it and react to it. One of the things that's already done very well for us is sea buckthorn establishes very quickly. We've developed our own gin off the back of our sea buckthorn production. So we're growing a whole variety of different things in this field and then thinking about how we can take those to market through a whole range of products under our brand. So, and then on a bigger scale, what we call Withy Pump, 50-acre field where we've gone for 24-meter spacing, alley cropping, and we had to decide what are we going to use as our main commercial species here. That's always a real issue, trying to work out what's the market going to look like for this thing in 15 years' time or longer. We've gone for Perry pears as our main commercial tree in there, interspersed with willow and alder mostly. We've done also some rows of timber trees as well to see how those progress in this kind of system. Next slide. That's matured a bit now, so that's starting to come along. We had our first decent harvest of Perry pears this year. We're making our first trial batch of cider this year. As I say, we are looking at things like alder as a way of, a leguminous tree to fix nitrogen, and we're intercropping. We've got livestock between those. We're mostly grazing. We've had a go at some arable between the trees as well. Next slide. We have created some new woodland as part of the project, very much thinking about living barns. So at woodland that's designed to be grazed and to provide shade and shelter for livestock to be integrated within the trees rather than being fenced off them as we are with the alley cropping. So we've created 2 or 3 little blocks of native woodland adjacent to the agroforestry so that we can do that. Next one. Lanes is a very big field, another 50-acre field that's nearly 3/4 of a mile long. Here we started by building in browsing blocks. We'll come to those in a moment. And reinstating the old hedgerows. Again, some woodland blocks around there too. And there's more work to do on this field. We haven't finished. We haven't yet all got the agroforestry all in there yet, but we've started to get the infrastructure there and the browsing blocks ready to go. Next one. Browsing blocks. This is, I think, hugely interesting, using willow and poplar, really close planted, with the idea that they are both good for livestock, provide some forage when you're in a drought year, but also really interested in the methane suppressing properties of willow, which there's some really good evidence starting to come through on that. So wanting to pop these little browsing blocks in everywhere where we have livestock. And we've got a first few of those. More recently, we are, like Ben was talking about, trying to think about how do you create sort of woodland pasture or woodland grazing on a sort of more parkland-like system. We have a few lovely old oaks in this field, and working with the Woodland Trust, whom we run our agroforestry show and the agroforestry booklet that we produce with the Woodland Trust. We have developed these roundels. Next slide, please. So the idea here, a little bit as Ben was talking about, but on a slightly bigger scale, we're planting about 65 trees in each little circle. We have our long-lasting species in the middle, protected by other trees, and trying to encourage trees to grow with other trees rather than just trying to do them on their own, which we had only very moderate success at when we were planting individually. The next slide. This is what some of them look like as they've started to get going. And we've had a go at fencing in all sorts of different ways to see how the outside fencing and tree guarding impacts on the survivability and success and growth rates of trees. I can talk more about that. I've got time later. Next slide. Yeah, learned lots of stuff along the way, particularly things like how to fence. We did try establishing hedges without tree guards on other places on the farm, and we have found that much more troublesome. So I'm afraid we're still going back to tree guards in most circumstances, unless we are protecting the whole site with a decent fence. Lots about ground preparation. Initially, we did everything in a rip line, and I think now I would probably rotivate and destroy the grass, which is the biggest enemy of trees as it's growing, and mulching, particularly with these dry summers we're having. If we started off mulching like you see there, we've ended up mulching at about a foot or more in depth to really give those trees a great start. It makes such a difference from every angle to get a really good amount of mulching round. Just to flag some of the work the Soil Association's doing in this area. Lots of agroforestry networks that we're building up. So anybody that's interested in getting involved and where we can help a bit more, do let us know. And also to flag, finally, our innovative farmers work on agroforestry. Next slide, please. Where we're doing lots of trials, including long-term silvopastoral work, 10-year trials through innovative farmers, and things like feeding willow to lambs for cobalt deficiency. And now there's a lot more money through Adopt. So anybody who wants to do more trials on this kind of thing, although it's only a 2-year spell, which isn't that helpful with trees, it's worth getting in touch and having a look at that. That is a real whistle-stop tour. There you go. I've finished.
Thank you, Helen. There were lots of words that you used that have raised lots of suggestions in the audience that we're going to come back to, like living barns and things, but we'll come back to those in the questions, I think, if we can. So I'm going to move us on just for the moment to Guy, who's going to tell us about what he's been doing on Riverford. Having said that, oh, there it is. Can't find the button, but I've just found the button. So Guy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and hello, everyone. I'm a vegetable grower. I really don't know much about trees. This is all very new to me. That's what we do. We grow vegetables in South Devon, quite often on pretty steep slopes. This field is a 25% slope. Next slide, please. But really, my enthusiasm for agroforestry and mixing things up came from the work I've done over 25 years with farmers, subsistence farmers in East Africa. And this is a guy called Edward in Western Kenya, who was one of the most inspiring farmers I've ever met. And what I particularly drew inspiration from was the predominance of perennials. Probably over 50% of their calories come from perennial crops, and just how mixed everything up was, so there would be, plantains, bananas, mangoes with vegetables growing underneath, maybe some cash crops of tobacco and coffee. I think that's a papaya just behind him. Next slide. And I don't know, I just wanted my farm to be like his, really. But I mean, the big question for us in the UK, I mean, people earn anything from £1 to £4 a day, probably in Kenya. When you're expected to pay £150 a day, how can you make this incredibly complex system work economically? So next slide. It's all integrated with farming as well, and indeed the cows are actually fed a fair amount of just like Helen's browsing of the willow, but trees make up a substantial part of their diet. Next slide. So back to the UK. I mean, on my farm, building a reservoir on the top of the hill. Climate change is here. It's all happening much faster than I think many of us expected, and that has meant if growing vegetables, we absolutely have to have access to water. So building reservoirs, drainage, putting up polytunnels, trying to take back some control from nature, I suppose. And next slide, please. And that's back again, the first field harvesting cabbages. And if you go to the next slide, which I think is, this was probably one of my most saddest days in my 40 years of growing vegetables. I've always been acutely aware that overcultivation was kind of our Achilles heel, perhaps particularly on our slopes. We were preparing to sow green manure, had a thunderstorm, and lost 10,000 tons of soil in about 20 minutes. Roughly an inch had gone off the entire 40-acre field, and I just realised that I just couldn't farm like this anymore. This was in no way sustainable, and we had to think again. And there are lots of things we can do, reducing the fetch, the length of rows, and so on. But in this case, the risk was just too high, and this field will never be ploughed again. It's gone back into permanent grassland with rows of hazels planted on the contour. We'll still cultivate the land above it just to make sure that we don't, that this never happens again. And the next slide. So I'm really inspired by our farm. It's very beautiful. South End, we have these wonderful banks, trees growing everywhere. This lane, it must be 80% hazel. You just can't stop them growing. I mean, really, we abuse them every year with a hedge trimmer, and they just keep on coming back. I mean, God, I wish I could treat my vegetables like that. So I love the idea of just growing, a perennial crop in the landscape, not requiring cultivation of the soil, something that actually wanted to grow, as opposed to we had to coax life out of it. And I'd walk down this lane and pick up a few hazelnuts each year. And finally, this, working with what I'd learned in East Africa, led me to thinking more about agroforestry. Next slide, please. And again, in the landscape, I mean, Helen talked about her, the centurion trees or whatever. We have a lot of these oaks. They are mostly reaching the end of their life. South Devon's grazing underneath. How could we get trees back into the landscape? But I really want to produce food as well. And anyway, I got a bit obsessed with hazelnuts, as I've mentioned, and walnuts. So the next slide, please. We grow on our particular farm now, where my wife and I farm. We grow a lot of perennials, so probably 70% of the cropping is down to perennial vegetables, but there are a very limited range of what you can grow in the UK. This is clove artichokes, which I have a particular obsession for. Next slide. That's a walnut tree, which I actually planted, being a good organic farming hippie or whatever, on my firstborn's placenta, buried out in the orchard there. You can see the apple orchard behind. That's a 35-year-old walnut tree, and it seemed to grow pretty damn well, placenta or not. And uh, so I thought I wanted to grow walnuts. I love eating walnuts. I love eating hazelnuts. So next slide, I started doing lots of research. Of course, in our area, a cider orchard with sheep grazing underneath it has been a traditional form of agroforestry for centuries. And I think sometimes we're a bit, me included, I mean, we're reinventing the wheel. There is actually a system that's worked really well. And why can't we produce apples like this? Certainly cider apples, instead of these uber intensive orchards, which everyone's moving towards now. It does seem a bit perverse that we're abandoning this system at the same time we're trying to introduce a new one to replace it. So next slide. So yeah, so my first attempt was actually growing those my beloved artichokes in amongst an establishing cider orchard, which worked pretty well. There were problems with actually the reduced airflow. I did get more mildew in the artichokes, but it was just difficult, just a basic organizational thing of harvesting the crop and carrying it out made me abandon it. In the end, I got sick of carrying hundreds of kilos of artichokes 50 meters to the top of the row. And so next slide. So over the last oh yeah, this is Martin Crawford, who is a bit of a guru of the agroforestry permaculture movement, and he lives and does his research very near us. So I sought advice from him, and I have to say he did give me really good advice as to agronomy and varieties. And so we went ahead and planted, I think 5 years ago, probably almost 30 acres in agroforestry with hazelnuts and walnuts. Next slide. So this is the field. Actually, this is a couple of years old. They're quite a lot bigger than that now. Maybe it's interesting. I took the decision to electric fence the rows, which I have to say in one field has worked. The field nearest my house, it worked really well, where they got the care and attention, and the battery never went flat, and actually had access to a mains fencer. And I think it's been really successful there. In another field, slightly further away, where I couldn't get the solar panel to work properly, and too often the electric fence failed. So I think it is a viable system, but it has to be done really, really well. And I would say that does mean access to a mains fencer and a borderline illegal fence that won't short out too easily. I think I'm the only person who's done it this way that I know of. Everyone else thinks I'm mad, but 5 years in, I still think it can work. These were on 16-meter rows, 8 meters between walnuts, with a couple of hazelnuts planted in between. I wouldn't do that again. I just felt I knew nothing about this. This was all new. One of them's bound to fail. If I plant two, I had a better chance of success. But actually, they both grew pretty well. I have no doubt that these cultivars of hazelnuts and walnuts will grow perfectly well in our climate. All the stuff about them needing 6 foot of perfect soil doesn't seem to be true either. I will. The one thing I'm a vegetable person. I'm learning about trees, but from my observation, trees really don't like being planted out on their own in the middle of a field. That's a pretty alien environment for a tree. And I think Helen said that she'd had trouble establishing single trees in fields, and I would certainly mirror that experience. I mean, that could be down to they haven't got the right mycorrhizal interactions. It could be down to it being more exposed. I don't know, but they certainly, in exposed situations, have not done so well. Next slide.
I think that's the last one.
And that's it. Yeah, that's me done. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Guy. So I just need to do a bit of screen organization so I can see all the right things in the right second. So thank you all for those presentations, and you can see that the scope for doing stuff is good, and you can see the hand claps going up from everybody around. So let's now have a little bit of a conversation about some of the things that, because you've obviously all learned things by your various activities. I'm going to start, if I may, with some of those thoughts that you were expressing, Helen, which is not where you're expecting me to go, but you talked about green barns and willows. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that? As people were asking questions about that in the chat.
Yeah, the nice surprise about living barns, the idea that you can actually use trees instead of concrete to keep your animals in if you're on the right kind of ground. And obviously, we're on really heavy clay down there, so you wouldn't be doing much of that in the winter, particularly for cattle. But in the summer, I think when you see how stressed dairy cows are when it's hot, having shade and shelter and somewhere for them to get some browse in a dry time, I think is an amazing opportunity. I think for other stock, people are doing some really interesting work with pigs in woodlands, and again, most of our farm animals actually evolved in woodland or in woodland edge, and most farm animals are happier in woodland or amongst trees than they are in open fields. So if you're really going to care for animal welfare and keep their productivity moving forward despite climate, I think that trees and things like living barns have got a real role to play. Willow, yeah, I mean, I think we're getting better at establishing these willow blocks. So they've been slow to get going, partly because of the deer pressure. But I think that would be, I think that feels like a super option for animals. We're trying to give animals more and more choice about where they spend their time and what they eat. We're growing lots of diverse lays, these kind of herbal lays, but actually being able to include tree browse in that. We know that there's loads of nutrients. You watch animals go down the road in the summer, the way they dive into the hedges and start pulling at things. You think, why are they all going for the bindweed at the moment? Or why are they actually pulling at cleavers? Animals know what they need. And so much of the time we're restricting them to fertilized ryegrass pastures rather than giving them the diversity of foods they're looking for. So living barns, browsing blocks are all part of giving animals a much more natural range of things in their diet, allowing them to self-select what they want to eat, allowing them to get into the shade or behind a tree out of the wind when they want to. And I think if we're really looking at animal welfare, and that's my strongest kind of passion in life, really, trees are just essential for almost every class of livestock.
One of the really intriguing things is if you wander around the country looking at big trees, as I have over the years, some of the truly oldest small leaf limes that you ever find anywhere in the country are in old drove roads. And in those old drove roads, they're there as old coppice stills that have been obviously coppiced, some of them, for centuries. And I always wondered whether those small leaf limes in those drove roads might actually just be the equivalent of the motorway service station of sort of the medieval times when the cows were being driven across the landscape. And you just coppice some of the small leaf lime to feed to your cows or stock as you were moving it across the country.
Absolutely. And it's the same for people. I would say plumb in fruit into every hedge you're planting. Why not just put some fruit trees every 20 meters into your hedgerow? Again, the Romans are the Ridgeway. We're right on the edge of the Ridgeway. There's a load of fruit trees along the Ridgeway, and the Romans actually planted apparently fruit trees along there so they could, they had food as they were traveling. So I think actually whether you're animals, whether you're people, plumbing in this stuff, even if it doesn't get used in the short term, it's always there for wildlife, but it's always there for people and animals too.
I know, again, from first-hand experience, Herefordshire, I know James is on the call who's involved in orchards in Herefordshire, and the dams and hedges of Herefordshire are a site that has to be seen because they planted them as sort of linear orchards along the edges of the fields.
Yeah.
Which again seems eminently sensible. Guy, we have a farmer on here called Fred, who said that he's a sheep farmer and he agrees that electric fencing is an amazing amazing way of keeping his stock off his. So you have at least one supporter in that regard.
First one I've met.
I have to say on the electric fencing thing, we've moved entirely to high tensile electric. For all the trees, all those alley crops were all done with high tensile electric. And in fact, we find if as long as you, as you say, Guy, keep the battery, you can have them on a mains or keep the battery power up, it's by far the cheapest way to keep your fences up together compared to all this, other stuff we used to use.
Ben, when we were together in Cornwall, we some of the projects that you did in Cornwall, they used the collars, didn't they, on the stock to keep the animals? Do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, so one site was exploring the idea of using no fence grazing, so the GPS control collars to try and see if they could establish hedgerows or alleys with those and essentially create a browsing line, and it worked quite well. The one trial they did where scattered trees in the landscape, didn't work at all because it created too many conflicts with the GPS and the cattle. Basically the warnings sounds would be going off all the time, and it would be very hard to train the animals to a more scattered landscape. But for the establishment of linear features, so hedgerows or alleys and things like that, it worked quite well as a system, because then you could create subdivide fields into various grazing cells and things like that. So as a technology, and trying to reduce that cost, like Guy and Helen have said about using electric fencing, it was just another essentially tool in the box that might be work in some environments, particularly if the landscape is quite difficult to fence as well. This is also being used to try and establish or do wood pasture grazing in very difficult sites, so be it on mires or steep grazing ground, where traditionally we might have had to fence everything, and it's just that sort of cost per unit area is just prohibitive.
Ben, there's a question for you that says, given your experience, what would you say are the top methods to encourage your Cornish farmers to introduce trees on farms? Why are they? What's their most often stated reason?
So similar to what Helen was saying, really about trying to reduce that exposure for livestock farming. Really, we've got a lot of maritime winds, and we're getting these sort of peak drought. Oh, sorry, you get sort of peak weather events where you get these extreme droughts in the spring. You get intensive rainfall events, and so and just really strong winds. We quite regularly seeing these sort of storm events becoming more frequent, particularly during the summer as well. So giving livestock the opportunity for shelter. Barn infrastructure is getting more and more expensive. So thinking of creatively how we might introduce shelter opportunities in the landscape, rediscovering where those old field systems were. We've got an incredible rich network of hedgerows Cornish hedges in Cornwall, the stone-faced earth banks, and in quite a lot of places those were topped with vegetation. And so for some farmers, it's just been a sense of rediscovering or actually trying to get trees back onto those hedge banks and things like that. Whereas through I suppose the advent of hedge flails, a lot of those habitat or hedges and vegetation just being managed downward, and that's purely for convenience rather than actually thinking, what could that actually provide my animals and provide my farm, that sort of incidental benefit, really.
Guy, Ben talked there about sort of slopes in Cornwall, and what's happened to your soil as a result of your activities? Have you noticed it improving? Have you noticed change?
You mean too early to say, I think, but I am astounded by how happily the trees. I mean, one of the, as I say, is a 25% slope. Actually, it's steeper than that in places, and really borderline whether you can get on there with a tractor at all. But the trees seem really happy growing amongst all the brambles and gorse and whatever. Yes, they needed 2 or 3 years to get away, but once they are away, that is their preferred habitat from what I can see. As I said earlier, they really don't like being on their own. I think too early to say what's happening to the soil. I think that'll be a few more years. Yeah.
And Helen, if I may ask you the sort of question, have you noticed changes to your soil as a result of your endeavours, or?
So again, it's still quite early days. We did a baselining of all of our soils when we started, so we've got hopefully a good, we'll get some good data over time. Anecdotally, we think that this heavy clay land is drying out quicker in the spring, which I guess is what you'd expect. One of the concerns we had on the farm was whether the drainage such as we had down there was going to get completely disrupted by all these trees. At the moment, it seems to be starting to help dry out land quicker in the spring. We haven't redone all our carbon and earthworm tests in the last year or two, so we'll need to pick up some more info on that.
Okay, there's lots of evidence though that deep-rooted trees do bring that nutrients up from the deeper layers if you have them on the farm. So
yeah, Yeah,
In theory,
exactly.
it should help.
The theory is good. I just and I think that it all makes a lot of sense. But I would like to see. These things don't happen in the blink of an eye, and we need to be seeing more in getting more data on that.
Agreed. I'm going to do another segue. I'm sorry, not got the questions but this is the stuff that's coming in. People are really intrigued by sea buckthorn. We saw sea buckthorn, didn't we, in Cornwall, Ben, with one of your projects? Do you want to and then we'll go to Helen on.
Yeah. So one of the sites they essentially imported cultivated sea buckthorn varieties because they were looking to sort of maximize yield rather than essentially just wild sea buckthorn. But for them, they went and sourced suppliers from Germany and sort of Eastern Europe because they have a long tradition of using sea buckthorn in sort of culinary uses there. And they actually then planted out essentially alleys, and it was undergrazed by sheep. They had to sort of manage suckering as well. So that's where the sheep also came in. Had real problems trying to manage bird essentially stealing all the fruit. So the project that's sort of been doing it, it's been an evolving process, looking at how they can grow sea buckthorn, and then they've been producing various foodstuffs from it, and then combining it with locally grown apples to make a blended fruit drink from that. And they've essentially got a product which they sell directly to the market, which has been a really nice story to see, really.
I'm a bit worried that by going for such diversity and so many wacky, probably niche crops, that we're just setting ourselves too high a mountain to climb, really. I mean, the reason I went for nuts was that I knew that there would be a market for them, albeit I would have to produce them at a competitive price, which is probably way less ultimately than current producers are expecting to get for their nuts. We have an extreme in farming now where everything is going towards scale and specialization and single enterprise farms, which I think is incredibly damaging. And I really want to counter that, but I think I do worry that by going for sort of too much diversity and setting ourselves too high, I mean, how are we going to pick that stuff? I mean, it has to be harvested. The nuts. The big question is how are we going to harvest them, and and it has to be done mechanically. If we're going to make this an economically viable system, we have to respect that the world has moved on. Agriculture is 0.6% of GDP and less than 1% of employment, and it has to be done in a mechanized way. Sorry, Helen, I wish you well with your buckthorn. Personally, I suppose I've spent 40 years as being accused of being a niche producer, and I want to be a commodity producer.
Yeah, no, well, it's the sea buckthorn's been really interesting for us because we planted it as a bit as like, let's just have a few of everything and see what works. And it was supposed to be the interplant between our main fruit trees in the quince rows, and it just has taken over. The quince don't like it very much down there, but the sea buckthorn just loves it.
Okay.
And so you're absolutely right. The challenges of harvesting it are legion. It's quite thorny, and the first year we picked it all by hand. So we're doing a lot of work on how do we more commercially and efficiently harvest this stuff. There is an increasing demand. A lot of the product that's coming into this country is coming in from Eastern Europe. So we are getting quite a lot of people saying, well, actually, it'd be quite nice to have a UK produced thing. But cracking the harvesting at the moment moment we actually freeze it and then shake it off the berries. But yeah, it's quite fun. So yeah, I think it's I think a bit of trying something new is fine. I will defend my kind of enthusiasm for trying some new things, but I take your point too about being able to do something reasonably commercially at scale. So we're going to try and.
I'm a total hypocrite, Helen. I'm guilty.
You are. It's from you, Guy. That is such a hypocritical thing to say.
One of the nice things about sea buckthorn is one of those little bits of trivia about sea buckthorn is that it's so rich in vitamin C that when the Russians were developing food for the astronauts, they turned an awful lot of the produce that they'd grown from sea buckthorn into astronaut food, because it was one of the best things to cope with both radiation and being in space. So maybe it's a niche market, Guy, for the British space industry. Maybe Helen's actually cracked the whole.
Tell it to Elon Musk.
So taking that thought then, Guy, about operating at scale, if a farmer came to you and said, I'd love to plant trees, and this would to all of you in a second, I'd love to plant trees, but I can't afford to lose a sort of an acre of yield, what would you say to them?
Well, I mean, the way we're doing it, we're not using any with the grazing. I mean, we're not losing any grazing potential of that land. And I even when they, in 30 years' time, where they're touching down the roads, I'm not sure we're going to lose that much. I mean, if you look at, how grass grows, or even how vegetables grow underneath an oak tree. I know I shouldn't be cultivating that close to them, but they can complement each other, as I learned in East Africa. So no, I don't think loss of productivity. I mean, obviously, if you want to grow a field of wheat, it may be, but if you're grazing, I don't think loss of productivity. The issue is the cost of establishment and all the uncertainty around how you're going to harvest, dry, process, and then what your route to market was. There's still huge uncertainty, and I guess I see my role as, I've made enough money that I don't need to worry too much about its economic viability, but to try and take it to the next stage at which I can actually massively reduce the costs, the risks for a new entrant, such that it is, a provenly economic viable system for producing food.
Helen, what do you think? How would you package trees on farms?
I think there is still a lot of work to do on the market development side. I think that's where there's much more to do. But I think if you're looking at climate resilience and you're in a livestock system, and you have a long enough tenure, because I think that's a real barrier for a lot of people. The big challenge for anybody thinking about trees is that you've got a big lag in time between planting them and getting any other income. And that's why it's been so helpful to see the agroforestry grants come through, because I think if we want more farmers to go down this route, they can't afford the cash flow of 10, 15, 20 years before they get a product out of the ground. And yet we know that probably at least a third, possibly a half of our new plantings in the UK could be in agroforestry systems, and you'd have loads and loads of other benefits. So everything makes sense, but it is that gap. Having enough tenure and having the confidence in the markets longer term, and being able to deal with the cash flow problems in the meantime.
In terms of the viability for nuts, which is my particular obsession, I mean, and actually probably most top fruit, everything's gone towards these single species, uber intensive orchards with reach over harvesters, scorched earth, not a single thing growing underneath it. I mean, to my mind, that's just another monocrop. It may be a perennial monocrop, but it has all the same problems. And where I see that system being adopted in Spain, it does come with very high pesticide usage, because you're designing a very unstable system. However, I think we need to be realistic about the challenges of trying to use a more mixed farming system, and I think a lot of that does come around. Well, just how you're going to harvest them, because they all have scorched earth, so they can sweep them up off the. And indeed, in Piedmont in northern Italy, they are now starting to get massive erosion issues due to the changing rainfall patterns. So it's not a sustainable system. But how we can do it, I mean, in Devon with a damp climate, you can't let the nuts fall and sit on the ground. I mean, you're just going to have lots of problems with fungal contamination and so on, let alone the feces from the animals. So we're looking at developing a whole new it's going to have to be some sort of shake and catch system, which is, it's going to be challenging.
One of the things that we at Tree Council are particularly keen for everybody to really contemplate is that agroforestry is obviously presented often as making the crop out of the trees. I see from my background here that hedges are a really vital part of those farming systems, and hedges aren't quite thought of in the same way. There's sort of hedges and there's agroforestry, and for me they're all part of the same system. They're all part of the trees on the farm doing those multiple jobs that trees do, both for the production of crop, but also from the protection of soil and the reduction of wind across fields. So I'd like to get to a place where everybody starts to thinking about all the trees on the farms in the round, and we don't have this sort of monocrop, as you say, Guy, this division of things into one or t'other. Ben, in a Cornish sense, I forgot my own question now. Sorry. Sorry. There was a question.
I was just going to mention on your question about losing, somebody coming to you and saying about losing land as well.
Yeah.
I think there's also so many actions we can do about improving our existing like hedgerow infrastructure and things like that. Planting, restoring a lot of that stuff to actually make it work harder on a farm, because so many of our hedgerows are degraded. They're at a point where they could be actually really improved and deliver all the benefits we've just been talking about without necessarily taking away, or if somebody has that concern, taking away from whatever their field productivity might be doing. So sometimes it's a good way to start out on an agroforestry venture scheme is to actually rediscover what you've got and improve that first.
Yeah.
Guy, oh, sorry, Helen, go.
Yeah, I was going to really agree with that. And also to say that one of the big challenges, I've certainly had to learn about trees as I've gone along. And I'm quite glad that you haven't asked me some of the technical questions in the chat today, because I still feel like I'm really sort of learning. And I think when you go to farmer school, you don't learn about trees in any shape or form. And I think it's that's a real challenge for all of us, because if we were as well versed in growing trees as we were in growing wheat, this would be a much less of a challenge. I mean, we've still got to address all the issues guys talked about trying to get that balance right between efficiency and diversity. But it's just not on the curriculum, and so I think a lot of farmers are almost frightened of trees. They see them taking land away, and they don't know, really, we don't know how to deal with them and how to make the most of them commercially.
It's just so complex. I mean, rather compared to growing wheat, isn't it? I mean, and the learning cycle is so long. It's a bit terrifying for a farmer, and we have become, farms have become so de-skilled. I mean, our farm would have had so many enterprises, including those cider orchards, including managing the woodland and the hazel and coppicing and so on. All those skills have gone, and it is quite a mountain to climb to get, to acquire the ones that we need to be successful in this.
And that then falls on organisations like ourselves and the Soil Association to try and improve the knowledge and information that gets distributed to people. Helen, I loved the fact that you were putting Perry into your landscape, because Perry is my favourite of all of the trees that people really don't notice. And if you go to Hereford and Worcester, the Perry orchards and the Perrys in the hedges are stunning. But lots of people have suggested you go and have a look at the National Perry Collection up at Hartlebury, if you haven't already done it. It is a remarkable place to go understand Perry and to see the range of Perrys that exist.
I will go and do that. Thank you for the tips, and some other good C. Buckthorn tips in the chat too. Really appreciate those.
And the trouble is, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, there have been so many queries and questions, both technical and others, that I haven't been able to even begin to do justice to all of your queries and questions. We might come back at you with some answers to the technical ones post the meeting, but I have 1 minute left. So in my 1 minute left, just going to ask you the one last question, which is, and for two of you, you're actually doing it. If you could recommend one tree to a farmer to plant on their farm, what would it be? So we'll start with Guy.
Well, it's got to be a food tree. So, and I love hazel, so it's going to be hazel, yeah, because they just love our farm anyway. It's the easy one.
Ben?
I'd say apples. We've lost so many orchards, and yet it delivers so much for not only wildlife, but also for animal husbandry and places like that. Little orchards, perfect.
And Helen?
Well, what's the right tree in the right place kind of thing. So you can't really just have a favourite. Up on our chalk, I'd plant beech. I love those beech copses that we see in the landscape up there. And on our clay, I'd still probably go for an oak. Is there anything better than an aged oak? But yeah, of course, I love all my trees that I'm going to make some, something to eat from. But those are as trees in their own right, for their own being, I'd go for those two.
And for me, I'm afraid I would go for Perry. But I need somebody to do what they do in France and make Perry in the traditional French hard cider bottle, natural fermented. I've not yet found one in England that I like as much as the French. So I need somebody to come up with a French champagne version of Perry, and then I should be a very happy man.
Let's talk.
Let's talk, Helen. Thank you to all of our speakers this afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I didn't get to cover all of your questions. There were just so many of them that I haven't been able to cover them all with due justice. But thank you to Guy, thank you to Helen, and thank you to Ben for being here for the last hour. I hope you've all enjoyed the conversation, and certainly from the reactions, it seems that everybody has. And so to all three of you, on behalf of the Tree Council, thank you for joining us this National Tree Week. And thank you to the audience too for being with us. We hope that was an informative and inspirational hour. Thank you all.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.